Okay, so we're going to start by having a little look at the socio-cultural issues in physical activity, component 3 of our A-level PE course. And it includes section 3.1, Sport and Society, and 3.2, Contemporary Issues in Sport. I'm going to have a little introduction to this with you. So the socio exam is going to be 60 minutes long. That will be 60 marks, including a 10-mark extended essay or extended writing question. And then 3.1, Sport and Society, we start to investigate socio-cultural factors that influence the growth and development of sport and characteristics of sport in pre-industrial Britain, post-industrial Britain, 20th and 21st century. And we also look at hosting global events. So the reasons, benefits, drawbacks to hosting major events. And we also have a little look at the background as part of that section to the Olympic Games. Okay. So I want to start by just talking really generically about gloats. This is a really big section, but for me, if you understand 3.1, 3.2 is so easy, because remember the rule I say to you all the time, sport reflects society. If we understand society in each of these periods, then we will understand why sport is how it is, okay? So start off with gloats is the mnemonic I've given you. So whenever you see a question about the social factors that influence the development of sport, you're always thinking gloats. Now the exam question might ask you more specifically about one of them. So it may say gender, it may say literacy, it may say order, but it might just say social factors. So if it does, please remember your social factors is anything that affects society, anything that affects people's lifestyles, their values, and in our instance here, it affects the way sport is played and pursued. So it can be things like wealth, gender, ethnicity, religion, anything like that. Okay, law and order. So try and have a little quick thing for me. What is gloats? What does the GLOATS stand for? See if you can recall it, write it down, or just press me on pause, say it, and then just check that we got it all correct. So once we've established the questions asking us about the social factors, we then need to identify the other instruction present in the question. In this example, it will almost always be the time period. So is it just generally social factors in the 20th century? Is it gender in the 21st century? So we've just got to make sure that we're nice and clear on what the question's asking us before we start. So to begin with then, our G obviously stands for gender. Gender, kind of key things that I would be thinking about here is that female athletes do and have faced discrimination all of the time periods that we studied. We'll be looking at how in pre-industrial Britain, the different activities, the different classes pursued different activities, but women were perceived to be physically inferior. Women had very few rights and limited opportunities, therefore, in sport. Post-industrial Britain, things got a lot worse for women, the strict Victorian ethos. And then as we start to get into the 20th and 21st century, things start to improve. However, females are still heavily discriminated against in sport. I've seen a statistic that said 40% of all participants in sport and physical activity are females. However, female sport only receives 4% of the media coverage. Okay, so we know when we're looking at discrimination in the 21st century now, things are getting an awful lot better, but there is still no parity between opportunities for men and women in sport. Limited media coverage, limited opportunities for professionalism. We've all had a look at the Forbes list for wages for professional athletes, and we've seen that the Forbes list are dominated by male performers. We've seen astronomical wages for male athletes. We're seeing footballers now earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a week. And obviously we're not seeing the same for female sports performers. However, as we start to look toward the 21st century, there are increasing opportunities for professionalism for women. And in some sports like tennis, golf, there are opportunities to earn more money than there are in some of the other female sports. I've seen a statistic that said Sharapova is worth an estimated $24.4 million. Okay, so she's not doing too bad, but it is very limited for females. There are much fewer role models And again, that is improving through all of these time periods that we've been looking at. Equality for women has obviously been incredibly relevant in 2018 when we've been looking at it being 100 years since females were given the vote. So we've seen in the 20th century changes in female opportunities. We've seen the change in role of women in relation to society throughout the wars. We've seen increased opportunities for women in sport in the 60s and 70s, and the rise of role models such as Billie Jean King, who won the Battle of the Sexes in 1973. Switzer, who was the first female marathon runner. It was thought that women were would not physically cope with marathons until 67 that was. So not that long ago we're talking here. Role models today, I mean, I would be thinking of people like Serena Williams. You're looking at Jess Ennis, major sports stars in football like Tony Duggan, Farrah Williams. Okay, choose some female role models of your choice. I would try and choose some for each time period. So if we're looking at post-industrial Britain, we're talking about like the likes of Lottie Dod, the Wimbledon champion in 1887. She did win a number of Wimbledon titles. So I had that Billie Jean King for the 20th century, 21st. I'd be looking at Serena Williams, I think, is an excellent one. Stereotypes, female performers face lots and lots of stereotypes. We looked at things like perceived physical inferiority, couldn't run marathons, that women, basically questions over women's femininity and even sexuality when they've been involved in sport. We know that the sport, like the media has talked quite a lot about females and female sports stars in relation to their attractiveness. There's been lots of stories where the media have been talking really heavily about female performers' husbands and partners as opposed to their successors. And then the final one there for you is less opportunity provision and esteem than men. Although we have had equal pay bills passed, and we are striving for equality in society, there is still not equality between men and women. You only have to look at the Fortune 100 companies and the wages of some of the top males, TV presenters in the BBC. Okay, so there still is a wage gap. Obviously, income affects opportunity in sport. Fewer teams and clubs for females. Less free time because the role of women is still perceived to be the caregivers. I mean, after England women came home from a Football World Cup, in which I think they finished third, the FA sent out a tweet that said Lionesses going back to being mothers, parents and daughters. I mean, they did actually remove that tweet. And it was complimentary at the end, saying they're also now taking on the title of heroes. But again, reference to their role as kind of mothers, caregivers, and as opposed to congratulating their skill and endeavour. Also been debates recently about women in relation to maternity. When they're coming back, so Serena Williams coming back from maternity, does she keep her rank and does she not? So there are lots of things to overcome still with female sport. Literacy and education. Well, we know literacy and education throughout all the time periods that we've studied have increased. You know, we only had to look at pre-industrial Britain, widespread illiteracy amongst the lower classes. We're getting into post-industrial Britain. We had the public schools, which we know have been incredibly influential on the development of sports. They helped to codify sports, run NGBs, take our sports and spread them across the empire, develop clubs and leagues. So the public schools were incredibly influential. We had things like the Forced Education Act, increasing the education of the lower classes, the introduction of state schools, the Butler Act, the development of physical education and the change in PE curriculum, which has obviously improved physical literacy of all classes. However, you can link education to class as well. People of the upper and middle classes have better opportunities in education more often than not, and that's been seen with the Olympic team. The majority of the medals for things like cycling and rowing coming from private and grammar schools, who can afford better coaches, better facilities. But education on the whole part is linked to codification. If education's improved, because education's improved, codification of sport has improved. We have gone from not just having national governing bodies like the FA here, 1863, but then to FIFA 1904, so going into the 20th century, UEFA 1954. So we've gone from national governing bodies to world bodies, European bodies, all of that, because obviously sport has become a global commodity now. And then we've just had a little look at school opportunities. PE, like I said, is incredibly important. It's about physical literacy, for introducing children to sports, and they can develop a love for sports. School club links, encouraging mass participation. So schools are incredibly important. It always links to codification. Order and law, society. We obviously were looking at pre-industrial Britain, where there was very limited law and order. Society was very brutal, barbaric, and it was reflected in the sport. As society has undergone its civilising process and law and order has become more prominent, more regulated. If we regulate society more, we have regulated sports more. So we've seen big changes in post-industrial Britain. We've seen the introduction of metropolitan police, control of gambling, introduction of our national governing bodies, and then throughout the 20th century we've seen huge rule changes. I know it shocked me when I seen that red and yellow cards were only introduced in the World Cup in 1970. That's not long ago. You've only got to watch a game from in the 20th century. Even go back as far as Vinnie Jones, not even that far ago, and you could see just how violent football could be. So we've seen rule changes to increase the safety of performers and ensure fair outcomes, and increasingly rule changes that we're seeing in the 21st century are around safety as well and excitement. So we've seen, for example, American football, rugby taking concussions much more seriously. So we've seen rules to lower the tackles, no high foot in football, no shoulder charge in rugby. We've seen fairer technologies introduced to ensure fairer outcomes. 2018 World Cup, there'll be the introduction of VAR. We've had goal line technology in the Premier League, Hawkeye, and thermal imaging in cricket to check for edging of the ball, anything like that. Okay, or LBWs. You've even had the sonic one, having with the sound technology introduced in cricket. So cricket's got quite a lot of technology, and also rule changes to increase excitement, to make sports a media commodity, basically to make them suit the media more. So we've seen things like netball introduce some fast net. We've seen massive change in the 20th century with things like golden goal, silver goal, penalty shootouts in football. And the other one I was thinking about is badminton. Changes to the scoring in badminton to make the game faster, more exciting, more attractive to the media. We learned in 3.2 that means they are more likely to attract sponsorship, bring in income to the sport, and therefore allow for its growth and revenue. So increased number of competitions also as a result of increased law and order. We know in pre-industrial Britain, lower class sports had very little regulation. They were locally coded and locally significant, and therefore there was no development of national governing bodies, no league structure. But obviously as the ability to travel increased, there was an increasing need for a standardised set of rules. So we've seen the introduction of competitions, cups, leagues. So I was just again thinking about football. We obviously had the FA Cup introduced in post-industrial Britain. As we move into the 20th century, we got the Premier League, I think it was 1992, the introduction of World Cup, Champions League. So we've seen a massive rise in that, and obviously that means an increase in regularity of sports. Availability and time and money. Time and money are imperative for sports involvement. Money obviously is needed there for facilities, coaches, equipment, membership fees. Good sports to think of there, I think things like golf and tennis. Really good. Obviously golf, if you think you want access to golf clubs, some of which the membership fees can be incredibly high. They're very skilled sports, so you can be very reliant on coaches. I know I've had a little look at tennis. David Lloyd membership is incredibly expensive. You'll then pay additionally for tennis membership, and then you can pay privately for coaches as well, which can be charging anywhere up to kind of £30 an hour. Equipment, membership fees we've already discussed. Increased cost of some sports. This has kind of changed quite a bit throughout the 20th and 21st century, cost of sports. Some sports, the cost of them has increased. So we see things like now, there are an introduction of pay-per-view channels. So we now can pay for Sky Sports, and then there'll be additional pay-per-view matches on for things like boxing. So we're expected to pay additionally. Season ticket prices are incredibly high for English Premier League teams in comparison to teams in Germany. I mean, Bayern Munich season tickets around £200-300. When you could be looking at £1,000 for a season ticket at the Emirates. So some sports, the cost of involvement has increased significantly. You only have to see things like football shirts. I mean, I went to Barcelona and it was around about £150 for a Barcelona shirt. Football boots now, they range in sort of quality, and you can be paying again anywhere from £40 for a pair of football boots to £250-300 a pair. However, some sports have become more affordable as well. There's been the introduction of municipal, I can't say that word, but council-run gyms, council-run golf courses to make some of the sports more accessible. There's been national governing body initiatives to subsidise some sports, subsidise courts by the Lawn Tennis Association, the development of lots of football pitches and facilities by the FA. Making some sports more affordable. There's also, in terms of money, been opportunities for professionalism in a lot of sports now. Sports can be seen as a way to go from rags to riches. We talked before about the astronomical wages being earned. We know in post-industrial Britain being a footballer was a really good job because you were getting twice what you were getting in the factories. And then obviously the removal of the wage cap in the 20th century has seen just huge rises now. We're seeing boxers earning tens of millions of pounds for just one fight. So they have increased significantly. Some sports have become more affordable, said that one. So free time and leisure time is obviously required for sports participation and to spectate in sports. In terms of free time, we've had a reduction in the working hours from what we were looking at in post-industrial Britain, where we were talking about a 666 to 20th century, 21st century, coming down to 40, averaging around 40 to 42 hours per week in England. There's also been an increase in flexible work patterns, making sport more available. And lots of gyms and clubs and teams are now on in an evening, later times to make them more accessible. Okay. Transport then. Transport has advanced significantly. We talked about horse and carriages for the upper classes in pre-industrial Britain. We then moved into post-industrial Britain. We talked about the development of the railways and how influential they were, making sport regional, not just regional, but national, and then even international tours of Australia in sports like cricket. We've seen the introduction of roads, cars, underground air travel throughout the 20th century, making travel to international fixtures, again, to participate in things like sports tours. I went to a sports tour to Holland when I was about 11, okay, so we've seen the introduction of things like that throughout the 20th century, 21st century. Again, we've seen that, but again, things just becoming more and more affordable. So Ryanair and budget airlines now making it more and more accessible. So we can travel further, faster, and this has led to the development of league and cup competitions and increased regularity. Freedom of movement is the other one there. Now that could be an interesting question on the exam. Freedom of movement is obviously to allow players from the EU to go and play in other European countries, which I think we could talk about has positives and negatives. So positives for the English Premier League, for example, is that we've seen a massive rise in standards. We've got some of the best players in the world playing the English Premier League. However, drawbacks is it's also had a knock-on effect on the development of homegrown talent. As a result, in England, for the Premier League, they've introduced a rule to say of the 25-man squad, 8 have got to be homegrown. So you could talk about the positives of that. However, homegrown does count as a player who has been on the club's books for 3 years prior to turning 21. So what it's often meaning now is clubs are just trying to pick up younger players and take them from their countries, and then they're classed as homegrown players. So Cesc Fabregas is a good example, somebody who was classed as a homegrown player, despite being Spanish, obviously. Other thoughts on the Freedom of Movement Act? So positive development of English players, however we can get around it. That's probably all for that one. And then social class, Upper class and middle classes have greater OPE because they can play, as a result, they can play sports that last longer. Think about class linking to the cost of the sports they're involved in, the length of time the sports last for, and the skill level. I always think are really good ones. So upper class can play sports which last longer, cost more, and have a higher skill level. Because if you've got more time, you've got the time to develop the skillfulness. You've got the money to afford coaches and specialist kit and equipment. They also often competed as amateurs. So pre-industrial and post-industrial Britain, we talked about amateurs and professionals linked to class and income, whether they were paid or not. Obviously, in the 21st century, we link it to whether you're paid to participate, and then obviously we make a link to ability. Lots of wealthy upper class individuals now compete as professionals in sports like Formula One, golf, tennis, and the likes. So lower class participate in sports that cost less money, football and rugby, lasted a shorter duration, boxing, or often sports in the 20th century. We talked about sports that involved the pub, or participated in the pub. We talked about the working class males in the 20th century, would be working. In Liverpool, we might be talking about working in the docks, and then it was kind of common to go to the pub on the way home, participate in darts, pool, snooker, boxing matches even took place at pubs, and they often competed as professionals. So a good sport for professionalism is always football, isn't it? It's a chance to go from rags to riches. Rugby league is another good example there. So that's an overview of gloats. So if you understand, the impact each of them things has, so transport links to whether a sport is regional, national, how far you can travel, the development of leagues, availability of money, the equipment, the skill level of a sport, how long a sport can last. And then we will look a little bit further into each of them time periods in particular. But that's a good little start for us if you can have a little go at that.